Since Docker requires a Linux-compatible kernel to run, macOS, Unix, and Windows cannot run Docker Engine natively. In the early days of Docker, we had a tool called Boot to Docker, which was a stripped-down Linux image with Docker installed. Boot to Docker allowed users to issue Docker commands on their Macs to the remote Docker daemon running in the virtual machine. More recently, Docker has packaged Docker Engine, Docker Compose, Docker Machine, and Kitematic as a product called Docker Toolbox, which can be installed on macOS using a simple installer. The boot to Docker image is still used, but instead it is managed by Docker Machine, which we'll discuss in the next chapter. Let's go to the Docker website and download the Docker Toolbox. Once the installer is done downloading, we'll click on it to launch the installation. Next, we'll continue to install the Toolbox applications. This next window allows you to exclude certain tools from the toolbox. We'll go ahead and leave them all selected. The installation will install the Docker client binary in /user/local/bin and make it available to all users on the system. Since Docker needs a hypervisor to run the boot to Docker VM, VirtualBox will be automatically installed if you don't already have it. VirtualBox is a free and easy to use hypervisor. Finally, enter your password to complete the installation. Now that we've installed Docker Toolbox, we can launch a shell with Docker fully configured by running Docker Quick Start Terminal. Docker Quick Start Terminal is a convenience application that launches a terminal window and then starts up a Docker host in VirtualBox and configures the appropriate environment variables to allow you to issue Docker commands from your Mac. Let's fire it up. The first thing that the Quick Start Terminal will do is start up a boot to Docker VM in VirtualBox using Docker Machine. If you haven't already created the default VM, it will be created for you. And now that our Docker VM is started up in Docker Machine, we get a little Docker whale ASCII art and some information about our Docker environment. Here it says, Docker is configured to use the default machine with IP 192.168.99.100. What this message means by default machine is that a VM in Docker Machine named default is running, and your local Docker client is configured to control it. For general Docker use, you can just use the default machine. In the next lesson, we'll discuss creating other machines using Docker Machine, as well as in our lesson about Docker Swarm. On most systems, the default Docker machine will run on 192.168.99.100. When we refer to the Docker host, this is the IP of the machine we're talking about. For Linux systems, the Docker host will refer to localhost. Unlike Linux, we don't need to run the Docker command with sudo or be in the Docker group. Otherwise, the usage is the same as on Linux. Let's give it a test drive. Let's try running a sample Docker container that I created for this course, just to make sure everything is installed properly. This Docker container is called Hello O'Reilly and should simply echo the phrase Hello O'Reilly. Let's try it out. As expected, our container echoed the phrase Hello O'Reilly. In the Linux installation lesson, we ran another Hello O'Reilly container that exposes the phrase as an HTTP endpoint. On Linux, we could simply access the HTTP endpoint using localhost, but we'll need to access it using the Docker host IP address on macOS. Let's try running the HTTP version of Hello O'Reilly using the -p parameter to make the service available on the Docker host. This container is running a web server bound to port 4567 inside and outside of the container. We'll discuss port mapping in a later chapter. To access our containerized Hello O'Reilly web service, we can curl our Docker host on port 4567. As expected, our HTTP endpoint returned the text Hello O'Reilly. In the next lesson, we'll discuss Docker Machine a little bit more.